Ruth Calloway carried her own chair from the corner because not one of them would clear a desk for her. She thanked them anyway. Didn't flush, didn't argue. The next morning, Harlan Pruitt set his coffee down on her open ledger and said, "Sweetheart, this column work isn't a place to find a husband. Just keep the pencils sharp." 11 men in the front office. Not one looked up. But there was a fountain pen she kept capped by her blotter, 3 worn letters engraved on the barrel. And $14,000 had already walked out of Ashford Stove Range Works. Only one person in that room had ever done this for a living. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Ruth Calloway carried her own chair. The men wouldn't clear a desk for her, so she took the chair from the corner and set it where there was room. And then she thanked them for it. She did not flush. She did not argue. The purchasing agent, a well-liked man named Harlan Pruitt, set his coffee cup down on her open ledger one morning and said, "Loud enough for the whole front office to hear it, sweetheart. This column work isn't a place to find a husband. Just keep the pencils sharp." 11 men sat in that room. Not one of them looked up. By her blotter she kept a fountain pen, capped, engraved with 3 worn letters, and $14,000 had already walked out of Ashford Stove Range Works. Only one person in that room had ever done this for a living. If you believe respect is earned in silence, then stay with me. The bus came into Rennick, Ohio on a cold Tuesday in the autumn of 1963. It came in past the grain elevator and the shut-up dance hall and the water tower with the town's name going gray. Ruth Calloway got off with 1 suitcase. That was all she had. 1 suitcase, a gray coat, and a way of standing that didn't ask anyone for anything. Rennick was a stove town. It had been a stove town for 60 years. Ashford Stove Range Works sat at the north end of Maine with its brick smokestack and its long low sheds, and it fed 200 families, and everybody in Rennick knew that if the plant ever went dark, the town would go dark with it. The plant was the spine. Everything else was ribs. Ruth took a room above the pharmacy. She took the junior bookkeeping post nobody else wanted, the one down in the front office where the light was bad and the radiator knocked. She did it because it was quiet, and because it was small, and because a woman could sit in that corner for 20 years and nobody would ever look at her twice. That was the whole idea. That was the point of the place. She had come a long way to be no one, and Rennick was a fine spot to be no one in. She was precise. She came in early, before the whistlemen. She was gone before the whistle blew again at 5. She kept her desk bare. She kept her voice down. When the other clerks talked about the weather or the ball scores or somebody's cousin's wedding, Ruth listened and smiled and said very little, and after a week they stopped trying, which suited her fine. There was a thing she did, though, that she had to watch. The plant ran everything through an adding machine, a big black Burroughs with a crank, and the girls fed the figures in a column at a time and pulled the handle and read the tape. Ruth's second morning, a clerk named Enid handed her a page of freight charges to total. 19 lines. Ruth ran her eye down the column, and the number was simply there, the way a name is there when you read it. She wrote it at the foot of the page. Then Enid ran the same column through the Burroughs, and the tape came out, and the number matched, and Enid looked at her a little strange. "You didn't crank it," Enid said. "I'll crank it next time," Ruth said. "I was just checking myself." And after that she cranked it every time, slow, 1 line at a time. Even when the answer was already sitting finished in her head, she made herself slow. That was a habit she had learned to keep, the way some people learn to keep their hands still. You did not show anyone how fast the machine in your head went. You let the black Burroughs be the smart one in the room. It was better for everybody that way, and it was much better for her. So that was Ruth Calloway in her first weeks. Early, quiet, careful, a gray woman in a gray coat at a bad desk. If you had walked through the front office of Ashford Stove and Range Works that October, you would not have marked her at all. Which is exactly what she wanted, and exactly what let it all happen. Now the men. The front office was a room full of men who liked each other. That was the truth of it. They had gone to school together, some of them. They hunted together in November. They were not cruel men. Most of them, not the way you think of cruel. They just had a set of rooms in their heads, and the women went in one room and the work went in another, and it never occurred to a single one of them to knock down the wall between. The tedious jobs came to Ruth. The reconciling of petty cash, the filing of the carbon copies, the adding of the long, dull columns nobody wanted to add. Give it to the new girl, they'd say, and the folder would land on her corner of the desk, and she would do it, correct and silent, and hand it back done. They called this being helpful. Ruth called it nothing. She just did the work. Harlan Pruitt was the son the whole office turned toward. He was the purchasing agent, and he ran the office besides. And he had a good face and a good handshake, and he remembered your children's names. When Pruitt came through in the morning, the room warmed up. He'd rap his knuckles on a desk, tell a joke, ask after somebody's mother. Everybody liked Harlan. Walter Ashford, the old man who owned the place, liked him like a son. Del Hargrove, the plant manager, trusted him like a brother. That was Pruitt's real gift, if you want to call it a gift. People handed him things. They handed him their trust with both hands and never asked for a receipt. He took to calling Ruth our little schoolmarm. He didn't mean it hard. That was the thing. He'd sail past her desk with a stack of requisitions and drop them in her tray and say, "There's my little schoolmarm, keeping us all honest," and grin, and the men would chuckle, and Ruth would say, "Good morning, Mr. Pruitt," and go on totaling. He thought he was being warm. In his own head he was being kind to the nervous new woman in the corner. That was the room Ruth lived in Harlan Pruitt's head. The kind to her room. He never once thought there might be a different room, one he couldn't see into at all. One afternoon, two of the younger clerks got to ribbing her, gentle, about where she'd come from. Ruth had never said much about that. "Back east somewhere, isn't it, Miss Calloway?" "Back east," Ruth agreed. "Doing what?" "Checking columns," Ruth said. "For the government, a while. Back east." And she let them fill in the rest for themselves. She watched them do it. She watched one of them picture a big room full of women at typewriters, a pool, a gray federal building, a girl among 100 girls stamping forms. She could see the picture arrive on his face. It was a comfortable picture. It sat right down in the room they already had for her. Ruth didn't correct it. She reached over and squared her carbon copies and said, "Is it always this cold in here in October?" And the subject moved, the way she had moved it, quiet, with two hands, and nobody felt the wall get touched. By her blotter, capped, sat the pen, black, plain, an old one, with 3 letters worn nearly smooth on the band of it. It looked like nothing. A pen a person might have been given a long time ago and just kept. Nobody in that office ever picked it up. Nobody asked. Why would they? It was just the schoolmarm's pen. Then, in November, the trouble came out into the open, and the office stopped being comfortable for anybody. The parent company sent its auditors. That was the first thing. Ashford Stove and Range Works had a parent company 2 states over that owned it on paper, and every so often the parent sent men in suits to go through the books, and usually it was nothing. A week of frowning, and then a train home. This time, the men in suits found a hole. Money was gone. Not a lot at once. That was what made it bad. It was gone in a way that added up. Over 19 months, going back and back, the numbers didn't close. $14,200 had left the plant, and there was no place it had gone to. The auditors couldn't find it. They ran the columns, and the columns footed. They ran them again. Everything on the page was correct. And yet at the end of 19 months the plant was 14,000 and change poorer than the paper said it ought to be, and no man in a suit could tell you how. Del Hargrove came apart a little. You could see it. He was a big square man who'd run the floor for 20 years, and he started coming into the front office 3 times a day with his collar open and his face red. And standing over the desks, talking too loud. Because it wasn't just the money. The Farmers and Merchants Bank held the plant's note, and the bank had heard, the way a bank always hears, and the bank had given the board 30 days. 30 days to find the leak and plug it and show a clean book, or the bank would call the note. And if the bank called the note, the plant would close. And if the plant closed, Rennick was finished. 30 days stood between 200 families and the dark, so the men stood around Ruth's desk and argued about it as if she weren't there. They did that. They'd pull up chairs and lean on her filing cabinet and go at it, back and forth, right over her head, and she'd sit there with her pencil going, adding her long, dull column. While 3 feet above her they shouted about the $14,000. She was furniture to them. She was part of the desk. It never crossed one mind in that room that the quietest person at the meeting might be the only one in it who'd ever seen this exact thing before. And Harlan Pruitt calmed them all down. That was Pruitt's role in it, and he played it beautiful. He'd come in on the worst of the shouting and put a hand on Hargrove's shoulder and say, Del, nobody stole anything. This is sloppy filing, that's all it is. Some clerk transposed a figure back in '61, and it's been rolling forward ever since. It's an error, not a crook. We'll find it. And the room would breathe. Because they wanted so badly to believe him, and because he said it so warm and so sure, and because Harlan Pruitt had never once, in all the years they'd known him, given them a reason to look at him twice. Ruth, at her desk, 3 feet below all of it, did not look up. But she had started to listen in a particular way. Not to the words. To the shape underneath the words. And the shape was familiar to her, the way a tune is familiar before you can name it, and something in her chest had gone very still and very cold, the way it used to go, back east, when she was somebody else. It came to a head at the board meeting. Or rather, it came out of the board meeting, spilled out of it, into the front office, in front of everybody. The board met in the glassed room off the main floor, Walter Ashford and Del Hargrove, and the 2 auditors, and Pruitt, and a man from the bank with a leather folder. But the glass room was small, and the argument got big, and the door came open, and it moved out among the desks where the clerks worked. Ruth was at her corner. She had, over the last several days, gone home each night and thought about the shape underneath the words. And she had gone quietly, on her own time, into the freight records. Because the freight was the loudest part of the noise, and freight was a thing she understood in her bones. And she had found something small. She had found that the freight totals in the ledger did not agree with the shipping log out on the dock. The plant's own 2 records of its own trucks did not tell the same story. It was not the whole thing. She knew that. It was one loose thread on one sleeve of a very large coat. But it was true, and it was checkable, and standing there in the middle of all that shouting men who could not find the money, Ruth Calloway did a thing she had trained herself for months not to do. She spoke up. She didn't stand. She just said it, from her chair, in her small, even voice, into a gap in the noise. The freight totals don't reconcile with the shipping log, she said. The ledger's showing more freight paid out than the log shows trucks. If you want a place to start, I'd start there. For a second the room didn't know what had happened. It was as if the filing cabinet had spoken. And then Harlan Pruitt laughed, not unkind. That was the terrible part of it, always. He laughed the warm laugh, and he walked over, and he patted the top of Ruth's ledger with the flat of his hand, twice, the way you pat a child's head, and he turned to the room, to Walter Ashford standing right there in the doorway, and he said, Now, let's not have the new girl confusing herself with real accounting. She means well. She's been staring at these columns till they swim." And he smiled down at her. "You leave the reconciling to the men who do it, sweetheart. You just keep our pencils sharp." And the office laughed. Politely, the way a room laughs when the well-liked man makes a joke and you want to stay on his side of it. 11 men and a few of the clerks, a soft ripple of laughter, right down over Ruth's bent head. Walter Ashford, in the doorway, gave a tired little smile too, because he was tired and because Harlan had made it easy to smile. Ruth folded her hands on top of the ledger. She looked at her folded hands. And she said nothing at all. That was the bottom of it. If you'd been there, you'd have thought that was the end of Ruth Calloway. A gray woman in a corner laughed down in front of the owner of the plant, told to sharpen the pencils. She had said the one true, useful thing anybody had said in that room in a week, and they had laughed at her for it. And she had folded her hands and taken it. The men drifted back to the glass room. The clerks went back to their machines. Somebody cranked the burros. It was over. Except it wasn't the end. It was the turn. Because something changed in Ruth that afternoon. Quietly, the way the temperature changes and you don't notice till you're cold. For weeks she had wanted only one thing, and that thing was to stay small. To sit in the corner and be no one and never ever touch a thing like this again. She had come to Rennick to put it all down. She had put it down. She had been so careful. But there is a kind of person who cannot watch a wrong thing and leave it wrong. It isn't about pride with that kind of person. It's deeper than pride and quieter than pride. It's just the way they're built, down at the foundation, and you can send them to a stove town in Ohio and change their name to Calloway and sit them in the worst light in the building, and the thing at the foundation does not change. It waits. And then somebody sets a coffee cup on the ledger one time, too many, and it wakes all the way up. That night she stayed. She let the office empty out at 5. She sat at her corner with her gray coat still on the hook, and she waited until the last car pulled out of the lot and the janitor had gone through with his broom, and then Ruth Calloway got up and went to the vault where the old ledgers were kept, and she brought out 3 years of them, and she carried them back to her desk. And she turned on the one good lamp, and she began to read. She read the way she used to read, not the way the auditors read. The auditors had read down the columns, checking that each one footed, and each one did, and so they'd found nothing. Because a column that adds up correctly to the wrong number will pass every honest test you give it. Ruth didn't read down. She read across. She read the way you read a face for a lie, watching for the places where the story is too smooth. And within an hour, she found the first one. There was a purchasing column, month over month, that footed perfectly on the page. Every entry there, every subtotal correct, added up 10 times, and you got the same clean number 10 times. But when Ruth took that clean-footed number and set it against the actual bank deposits for the same month, against what the plant had really put in the ground at the farmers and merchants, the two did not agree. The ledger said one thing. The bank said less. Somewhere between the money coming in and the money being written down, a piece of it was being combed off the top. Cash netted out before it was ever recorded. The books were kept honest, entry by entry, on money that had already been shaved. That was why the columns footed. You cannot catch a thief in the addition when the thief did his stealing before the adding ever started. Ruth sat back in her chair. Her heart was going, but her hands were still. Because she had seen this before. Not this plant, not this man, but this shape, this exact, tidy shape. The honest-looking book sitting on top of the netted cash. She had seen it in a case a long way east of here, in a life she had left on purpose, and she knew what it meant, and she knew what it took to do it, and she knew, sitting there in the cold office at midnight, that Harlan Pruitt was a great deal smarter than anyone in Rennick, Ohio, had ever guessed. Smart enough to keep beautiful books, smart enough that paid auditors had gone home stumped, smart enough to laugh at the one person in the building who could see it. She recognized the shape of it. And the recognizing frightened her more than the money did. Because to see it was one thing. To do something about it was another. And doing something about it meant becoming, again, the person she had crossed half the country to stop being. 3 days after that, the letter came. It came to the pharmacy, to her room above it, not to the plant. A plain envelope. A Washington postmark. Ruth stood in her small room with her gray coat still on and turned it over once, and she knew the hand it was addressed in before she opened it, and for a moment she thought about not opening it at all. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, and she opened it, and she read it. Once. All the way through. She read it only the one time. Then she struck a match. She held the letter over the tin ashtray on the nightstand, and she let the flame take the corner of it. And she watched it go, the way she had watched so many things go, without any expression on her face at all, until there was nothing left in the ashtray but a curl of gray ash and the smell of it in the cold room. Then she washed her hands and turned out the light. Why she had left, what that letter had come to ask of her. She did not say those things out loud to anyone, and she burned the only page that held them. But she sat a long while in the dark that night, and she did not sleep much, and in the morning she went in early, before the whistle men, the way she always did. And she took a plain notebook out of her suitcase, a cheap thing, cardboard covers, the kind you buy at the pharmacy downstairs for a dime. She had not touched it since she came to Rennick. She uncapped the black pen, the one with the 3 worn letters, and she opened the notebook to the first blank page, and at the top of it, in a small, even government hand, she began, very quietly, alone at her cold corner desk with the radiator knocking, to keep a second set of books. She did not tell a soul. She did not accuse anyone. She was not building a case, not yet, not in any way she'd have called that. She told herself she was only checking, only satisfying herself. Only doing, on her own time, the plain work of setting the plant's real money beside the plant's written money and marking down, day by day, exactly where the two came apart. It was the smallest thing, a woman with a dime notebook in a corner. It was also the thing there was no coming back from. Because a person like Ruth Calloway does not keep a private reconciliation for 3 years running and then walk away from what it shows her. She knew that, uncapping the pen. She had known it since the match went out over the ashtray. She had come to Rennick to be nobody, and she had been so careful, and it had held for 6 good weeks. And now, in the bad November light, before any of the men had arrived to call her schoolmarm, Ruth Calloway bent her gray head over a 10-cent notebook and began, one honest line at a time, to become again exactly who she'd sworn she was finished being. The first name she would have to write in that book, when she was ready to write it, was a name the whole town loved. And she was not ready yet, but the pen was uncapped now. And once a pen like that is uncapped, it is only ever a question of when. She worked at night after that. Not every night. A woman who stays late every night gets noticed. And Ruth Calloway had spent 6 weeks learning how not to be noticed. So she picked her evenings. A Tuesday here, a Thursday there, always with a reason ready if anyone asked. She was behind on the freight postings. She was learning the filing. She was slow, she'd say, and smile the small apologetic smile they expected of her, and they'd nod and go home to their suppers. And the plain notebook filled up, one honest line at a time. The work was slow, because she made it slow. She set the plant's written money beside the plant's real money, and she marked, day by day, exactly where the two came apart. She did not guess, she did not accuse. She only counted. That was the whole of it. Counting was the thing she had been made for, and she had told herself she was finished with it. And here she was again, bent over a 10-cent book with the radiator knocking, doing the only work her hands knew how to do honestly. By the second week she had found the vendor. Delco Foundry Supply. It sat in the purchasing ledger like a good citizen. Clean invoices, round numbers, always, paid promptly, always, and always by the same hand. Harlan Pruitt signed for Delco the way other men sign for their own mortgages. Quick and sure, no questions. And that was the first thing wrong with it, though a paid auditor would never have seen it. Real suppliers argue. Real suppliers send a bill for $812.40 because that is what the freight and the pig iron and the war tax actually came to. Delco sent bills for $800, for $1,200, for a flat $500, thank you kindly. Nobody in the metal trade rounds to the dollar. Nobody but a man inventing numbers at his own desk. Then she found the tell. She found it because she read the way she always read, which was slowly and twice. On an invoice from the March before last, the company name was spelled Delco Foundry Supply, no R, a typographical thing, the kind of slip anyone makes, and she would have let it go, except that 11 months later, on a second invoice, from a different pad, in a different month, the name was spelled the same wrong way. Delco Foundry Supply. No R. Twice, Ruth put down her pen and sat very still in the cold. A real firm has a letterhead. A real firm has a girl in the front office who typed that name 10,000 times and could type it in her sleep and would never, not once, drop the R. But a man forging a supplier at his own kitchen table, working from memory, in a hurry, months apart, will make the same small mistake, the same small way. Because it is his mistake. Because there is no letterhead. There is only him, and the tell he doesn't know he has. She wrote it down. She did not write Pruitt's name yet. She wrote the 2 dates and the 2 misspellings, side by side in her small even hand, and she looked at them a long time. It was near midnight when the door opened, and she nearly knocked the inkwell into her lap. "Easy," a voice said. "It's only me. Sam Rourke. The floor foreman." A big quiet man who'd lost his wife 2 winters back, everyone said, though he never spoke of it. He had a coffee in each hand, and he set one down on her blotter, careful of the ledgers, and stood there a little awkward in his own kindness. "Saw the light," he said. "Figured whoever it was could use this." "Thank you," Ruth said. And meant it. He didn't sit. He wasn't the kind to sit where he wasn't asked. But he didn't leave either. He looked at the columns spread out under the lamp, the neat rows of her figuring, and something moved in his face. "My brother did books," he said. "In the Army. Quartermaster Corps. He used to say a ledger was the only honest thing in the whole war, because you couldn't argue with a column. It either added or it didn't." He shook his head. "He'd have liked you. You've got the same look he did. Like the numbers are telling you a story, and you're the only one in the room can hear it." Ruth's throat went tight. For one moment, one long, dangerous moment, she almost told him. Everything. The letter she'd burned. The pen with the 3 letters. The other life, the one back east. The vault and the men in the courtroom, and the reason she'd gotten on a bus with 1 suitcase and come to a town she'd picked off a map because nothing had ever happened there. She almost told this kind, sad man the whole of it, because he had brought her a coffee at midnight and asked nothing back. She didn't. "He sounds like a good man," she said instead. "Your brother." He was. Sam picked up the empty cup that wasn't there, remembered it was still full in her hands, and gave a short laugh at himself. "Well, don't stay too late. The light in this corner's no good for anybody's eyes." And he went, and she heard him check the plant door on his way out, the way he checked it every night, and she sat with the warm cup and did not drink it for a while. Then she went back to work. Because that was who she was. The last piece came the following week, and it came out of the freight log. The same freight log she'd tried to point at in the front office, the one Pruitt had patted like a child's homework while the whole room laughed. She'd been right that day. She'd only been early. The shipping charges were padded. Small amounts, never much on any one load. $4 here, $11 there, a fat 40 on a big pour to Columbus, and every dollar of the padding routed straight to Delco Foundy Supply, no R. For freight, the plant had already paid the railroad for once. Pruitt was billing the company twice for the same steel to leave the building, and pocketing the second bill through a supplier that did not exist. And there was a name on the payroll, a man named Earl Sowers, who drew a check every 2 weeks for shop labor, and whom no one on Sam Rourke's floor had ever laid eyes on. Ruth checked. She asked Sam, careful and sideways, whether Earl Sowers ran the number 3 press or the number 4, and Sam frowned and said there wasn't any Earl Sowers. Never had been. And who told her that? Nobody, she said. She'd misread a card. She was always misreading cards. Ghost vendor, ghost freight, ghost man. Cash netted before it ever touched a book. It was, she thought, quite good work. Not brilliant. Brilliant men get caught by their brilliance. This was patient and small and dull, and it had walked $14,200 out the front gate over 19 months. And it would have gone on forever if the parent company hadn't sent 2 men in suits, and if those 2 men hadn't handed the frightened plant a 30-day rope to hang itself with. She had it all now. In a dime notebook. In her small, even hand. And Harlan Pruitt was starting to watch her. She felt it before she saw it, the way you feel a draft before you find the open window. He was too warm now. Too helpful. He stopped by her corner and asked, so friendly, whether the old ledgers weren't too heavy for her to be hauling up from the vault room, and wouldn't she rather be up front, where the light was better and the work was lighter. He mentioned to Dell Hargrove, she heard it through the thin wall, that the little schoolmarm seemed awfully interested in files that were frankly above her station, and that funny thing, wasn't it, how the numbers only started going wrong around the time she'd come to town. He went into her desk one evening. She knew because she'd left a hair across the drawer, an old habit from an old life. And the hair was gone the next morning. He'd found the pen. The capped black pen with the 3 worn letters. She could picture him turning it over in his soft hands, this dependable town man, reading the little engraving and finding nothing in it. No meaning at all, and putting it back and sliding the drawer shut, certain he'd learned she was nobody. He had held the whole answer in his hand, and he could not read it. That was the thing about Harlan Pruitt. He had never once believed the answer could be sitting in the corner in a gray coat, doing girl work, thanking men who wouldn't clear her a desk. The board met on a Thursday. 6 days left on the bank's rope. She knew what the meeting was for. Everyone knew. The auditors had found nothing they could hang a man with, and a frightened plant with a called note coming does not wait for certainty. It looks for the door the trouble came in by. And the trouble had come in on a bus, 6 weeks before the deadline, in a plain gray coat, carrying 1 suitcase and a manner nobody could quite place. They were going to give them Ruth. She understood it clearly, sitting at her corner that morning, and she was not even angry. It was, in its way, the sensible thing. She was the outsider. She was the new arrival. She had been asking for old ledgers. A tidy story could be told, and Harlan Pruitt was very good at telling tidy stories, and by supper time the auditors would have their leak, and the town would have its villain, and the note would be held, and the 200 jobs would be safe. And only one small dull fact would be wrong with the whole of it. She hadn't done it. They called her in near noon. The board meeting had swelled and spilled out of the back room into the front office, the way things do in a plant where everybody's job is on the same table. The long counter. The bankman with his leather folder and his little slip of paper. Walter Ashford, old and gray and tired, to the bone. Del Hargrove, sweating through his collar. The two auditors, and Harlan Pruitt, easy and grave, the picture of a good man carrying a hard day. The 11 men who had laughed at her. Every one of them there. Miss Calloway. It was Ashford who spoke, and he did it almost gently, which was somehow the worst of it. "Sit down. Nobody's accusing you of anything. We only want to talk." He glanced at the slip of paper on the blotter, the bank's little death warrant, and he looked so old. The company's lost a good deal of money, and it seems to have started, more or less, around the time you— He stopped. He was not a cruel man. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" Pruitt spoke before she could, smooth as poured cream. "Walter, she's a nice girl, and she's frightened half to death. Look at her. This isn't a place for—" He gave the room his warm, sad, reasonable smile, the one the whole town trusted. "Let's not make her cry. Let's just get the auditors what they need, and be done." The men waited for her to fold her hands and say nothing, the way she had every other time. Ruth Calloway stood up. She did it quietly. She was not a large woman, and she did not raise her voice. She reached into her gray coat, and she brought out the plain cardboard notebook, the 10-cent one, and she set it on the long counter and opened it, and the little sound of the cover turning was the only sound in the room. "The money was never missing, Mr. Ashford," she said. Her voice was steady. It was not the voice they knew. It was lower than that, and it filled the room without any effort at all. "It's been walking out your front gate every Friday, in a good gray suit, and signing for itself." She turned her gray head, and she looked, for the first time in 6 weeks, directly and without apology, at Harlan Pruitt. "His name is Delco Foundry Supply," she said. "And it doesn't exist. He invented it, and he can't spell it." The coffee cup in Pruitt's hand went still. For a moment nobody moved at all. The bankman had stopped with his pen halfway to his folder. Del Hargrove had gone the color of paste. And Pruitt held his cup exactly where it was, an inch off the counter, as if he'd forgotten it belonged to him. "Now, he started. "Delco Foundry Supply," Ruth said over him, flat and clear, and she turned the notebook so the auditors could see. "No R invoice dated March of last year. And here." She turned a page. "Delco Foundry Supply. No R 14 months later, a different pad, a different month. A real company spells its own name the same way every time because a girl types it off a letterhead. A man inventing one spells it wrong the same way twice because there's no letterhead. There's only him." One of the auditors leaned in, the heavier one. He put his finger on the page, and he read it, and then he read the other one, and Ruth watched the weeks of his own frustration turn over behind his eyes. "Go on," he said. Quietly, to her. So she went on, and this was the part she did without any adjectives at all. "The invoices round to the dollar. Nobody in the metal trade rounds to the dollar. The freight's billed twice, once to the railroad, honestly, and once again to Delco, for the same loads leaving the same dock. The padding's small, and it's steady, and every cent of it routes to a supplier, with no address and no telephone and no R in its name. There's a man on the payroll called Earl Sowers who draws a check every 2 weeks. Ask Mr. Rourke on the floor. There is no Earl Sowers. There never was. And the cash from the counter sales gets netted before it's ever written down, which is why your columns foot on the page. They foot because they were built to foot. The money's taken before the book is made. Your auditors didn't find it because there was nothing in the book to find. It never got into the book. That was the whole trick. It's not a clever trick. It's just a patient one." She closed the notebook. $14,200, she said. 19 months. and it was never sloppy filing. Mr. Pruitt told you it was sloppy filing. He told you that, so you'd look for a mistake instead of a man. The silence after that had a weight to it. Harlan Pruitt set his cup down. It took him 2 tries to find the saucer, and when he spoke his voice had lost the cream in it, and what was underneath was thin. This is absurd. She's a bookkeeper. A junior. She's been here 6 weeks. You're going to take the word of a nervous little. He looked around the room for the faces that had always been on his side, and found them turned, every one, toward the woman in the gray coat. Walter, you've known me 20 years. You're going to let a stranger stand there, and Harlan, old Ashford's voice cracked like a dropped plate. How do you spell it? Pruitt stopped. Delco, Ashford said. Spell it for me. Right now. In front of everyone. And Harlan Pruitt, purchasing agent, office manager, the town's dependable man, opened his mouth and could not make it come out, because he did not know, in that moment, which way he'd spelled his own lie, and every soul in the room watched him not know. That was when the morning train came in. They heard the whistle of it down the valley, faint, and then, a while later, the front door of the plant office opened and let in the cold, and a man stood in it with his hat in his hand. Middle-aged. Plain suit. A tired, watchful face and the kind of stillness that makes a loud room go quiet without being asked. He looked around the office once, the way a man reads a room for exits and never says so, and then his eyes found the woman by the counter, and they stopped, and something in his face let go. Miss Calloway, he said. Ruth turned, and for just a second the steadiness went out of her, and what was under it showed, not fear, exactly, something older and more tired than fear. Agent Doyle, she said. We wondered where you'd got to. He came in slow, turning his hat in his hands. After the Ferris matter. You didn't leave a forwarding address. Some of us were concerned. He glanced at the counter, at the open notebook, at Pruitt frozen white beside his cold coffee, at the auditors, at the old man. He took the whole of it in one look, and he almost smiled. Though I see you've been keeping your hand in. Who? Said Del Hargrove, and his voice came out strangled. Who in God's name are you? Doyle reached into his coat and showed the room a small leather fold, and let them read it, and put it away. Treasury Department, he said. Fraud section. He nodded at Ruth, and when he spoke again it was to the whole room, but his eyes stayed on her, and there was something in them close to reverence. You'll want to listen to this woman. She cracked the Ferris ring in '58 when 4 of us couldn't. Testified against 6 men who'd stolen better than $1 million from the government. It cost her a great deal to do it. He paused. I wrote her a letter 3 weeks ago. Asked her to come back to the service. We could use her. He looked at the notebook on the counter, at the small, even hand. She never answered me. Now I see why. She was already working. The loop closed then, for anyone in the room quick enough to feel it close. Why a woman like that would come to a town like this, on a bus, with 1 suitcase, and spend 6 weeks being called schoolmarm by lesser men. She had done the work once, and it had taken everything, and she had come to Rennick to be no one at all. And she had lasted 6 weeks before a column that didn't foot pulled her back to the only thing she'd ever truly been. Nobody laughed now. The 11 men who had laughed. They were on their feet, some of them, without knowing they'd stood, watching her the way you watch a sky you read wrong all morning. The way you watch weather come in over a field you'd swore was going to stay clear. Harlan Pruitt found the last of his voice. I want a lawyer, he said. To nobody. To the window. I'm not saying one more word without a lawyer. That's the first sensible thing you've said, Doyle told him, kindly, and it landed harder than any shout. Del Hargrove could not look at her. That was the thing Ruth noticed, in the middle of all of it. The plant manager, who 6 days before had been ready to hand her to the auditors to save his own skin, stood with his eyes on the floorboards and his jaw working, and he could not lift his face to hers. She did not make him. She had never once, in either of her lives, made a man look at her who couldn't bear to. It wasn't in her. She just closed her notebook and let him keep his eyes on the floor. The rest was arithmetic, and arithmetic was easy. The auditors took her book and their own, and sat with Doyle through the afternoon, and by dark it was plain past any arguing. $14,200. Every dollar traced. The phantom vendor, the doubled freight, the ghost on the payroll, the cash netted before the book. What two paid men had chased for weeks, the notebook laid out in an afternoon, because the notebook had been kept by someone who already knew the shape of the thing before she ever found the first crooked line. The bankman watched it come together, and he opened his leather folder, and he took out the little slip with the deadline on it. And after a while, quiet, he tore it in half. The note would not be called. A plant that could show, in one clean book, exactly where its money had gone and exactly how it would get it back, was not a plant a sensible bank walked away from. 200 families would eat that winter. The town's spine would hold. They walked Harlan Pruitt out the next morning. They did it at the shift whistle, though no one planned it that way. It was only when the sheriff's man was ready, and the sheriff's man came at 7. So the floor was full. The presses were warming, and the men were at their stations, and the loading dock stood open to the cold, and out through the front gate, the same front gate the money had walked out of every Friday for 19 months, they walked Harlan Pruitt in his good gray suit. Nobody jeered. That was the thing Ruth would remember. She stood at her corner window and watched, and the whole floor watched, 60, 70 men who had drunk his coffee and laughed at his jokes and trusted him like a brother, and not one of them said a word. The presses ran. The whistle died away. And in the great silence of the plant the town's dependable man walked out past the whistle line with his head down, and the silence was the sentence, and it was heavier than any noise a crowd could have made. Then they went back to work. Because that was what the plant was for. Walter Ashford came to her corner that afternoon. He stood a while before he could say it. "I'd like you to have the office," he said. "Pruitt's office. Manager of the front. It's yours, if you'll take it." "I don't," his old voice failed him. "I don't know how to say what I owe you, Miss Calloway. I'd have handed you to those men. God help me, I was ready to." "You were frightened for your town," Ruth said. "That's a decent thing to be frightened for." He shook his head, not able to accept the kindness. "The office is yours." "I don't want the office, Mr. Ashford." She said it gently. "I don't want to manage the men. I never did." She looked toward the front, where Pruitt's big desk sat empty in the good light, and she looked away from it. "I'd only like a desk. With a window, if there's one to spare." He didn't understand her. Most of them never had. But he nodded, and he said of course, whatever she liked, and he went away still shaking his head at a woman who'd cracked the thing wide open and asked, for her trouble, only for a little light to work by. She didn't have to ask twice about the desk. She came in the next morning, and it was already done. There was a desk under the front window, the good window, the one that caught the east light off the valley, and it had not been there the day before. Nobody said who'd moved it. But Sam Rourke was there, straightening it a half-inch with his boot, and when he saw her in the doorway he stepped back from it and put his hands in his pockets, awkward as a boy. "Better light over here," he said. That was all. "Better light over here." He didn't say he'd carried it up himself before the whistle, though he had, and everyone knew he had. He didn't say anything about brothers or the army or the numbers telling a story. He just stood aside so she could have the window. And Ruth Calloway smiled. A small, real thing. The first one, maybe, that anyone in Rennick had seen on her face. She sat down at the desk in the light, and she took the black pen out of her coat, the one with the 3 worn letters, and for the first time in 6 weeks, for the first time in longer than that, if the truth were told, she uncapped it, and left it uncapped, and began the plain, honest books of an honest plant, with nothing to hide and nothing to hunt, in the good east light off the valley. By spring the plant was humming. You could hear it from the street, the low, steady heart of it. 200 jobs and their 200 suppers, the sound of a town that got to keep its spine. Ruth kept the front books now, and she kept them plainly, and she never once did the figuring in her head faster than the adding machine, or if she did, she let no one catch her at it. She'd made her peace with being seen. It turned out to be a smaller thing than she'd feared. Being seen. It turned out the people worth being seen by were the kind who'd carried you a desk without a word. Agent Doyle wrote her once more, that spring. He asked again, more careful this time, whether she'd think about coming back east, to the service, to the work. She read the letter through, once, at the window in the morning light. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer, and she did not burn this one, because there was nothing in it any more she needed gone. She was staying. She had answered him already, really, the day she'd stood up in the front office with a 10-cent notebook and named a man the whole town loved. That had been her answer. She'd just done it in Rennick, on her own terms, in a gray coat, for a plant that made stoves. That was answer enough. As for Harlan Pruitt, well, the narrator will give the man exactly 1 line, which is more than he gave the woman in the corner in 6 weeks of Fridays. His good gray suit is state issue these days. And they do not, where he is, let him sign for the freight. Some people are loudest right before they find out who was listening. Ruth Calloway walks home in the long spring evenings now, past the diner on the corner, and most nights Sam Rourke is in the window booth, with 2 coffees already poured. One black, one the way she takes it, waiting on a woman he never once mistook for furniture. She goes in. She sits down. The town goes by outside, whole and warm and none the wiser about most of it. And that suits her fine. She spent one life being loud in courtrooms. She'll spend this one quiet, in the good light, with honest books and a foreman who checks the door at night. That's the whole of it. That's what competence does, when it finally decides to stop being polite. It doesn't shout. It doesn't gloat. It just stands up one quiet Thursday, opens a 10-cent notebook, and names the man. Comment the town you're watching from.